It's day one after the patch. Let's take a look at some decks that are succeeding in this wild new metagame. I'm going to start with this Pseudo Mill deck built by Fudge, which I really refer to as Pseudo Mill only out of deference for what it used to be. This is an effective death mid-range deck, and what it's trying to do is weaponize discounts and relevant tech in a way that allows it to compete with the metagame. More important than that, though, it's trying to be a very powerful Shadow King deck. The recent releases of Mr. Fantastic First Steps, Human Torch First Steps, and if you go back a little bit further, Surge in combination with Galacta and Gwenpool have left the metagame full of green power cards. Being able to interact with those green power cards profitably is quite powerful. There are, in addition, still plenty of people playing the Fantasticar High Evo list, which is very vulnerable to a card like Shadow King. That means that this deck gets to be a deck that absolutely farms anyone relying on one-drops like that Fantasticar High Evo list, and still has a pretty solid matchup into other decks where Shadow King is actually applicable, while executing a fairly powerful game plan on its own. Being able to be a Hood Misery Shadow King deck is sort of the direction a lot of mid-range decks are going these days, and this is no exception. You'll also see Victoria Hand occupying a similar space in the metagame, but I have found that this deck, thanks to the Killmonger stuff, actually ends up favored in that Pseudo Mirror. Being able to blow up their demons, being able to play things like Death, if you can play that matchup properly, you should come out ahead a lot of the time. Now, what that means, though, is that this deck tends to have less raw power in their nut draws than, say, a Victoria Hand deck that is copying Victoria Hand a couple of times. There are smaller margins here. A card I specifically want to shout out is Lady Deathstrike, who can catch people off guard in the most devastating of ways. This is a card that not only blows up things like Surge and Mr. Fantastic, but can even hit an early played Captain Carter, or things that are generally going to be problematic for you, like a Mobius M. Mobius. That's a very powerful thing to do, especially in a world where most people are saving their things that stop this card from going off, like Cosmo and Juggernaut, until the final turn of the game. Being able to make sure that she gets her value in there is extremely powerful. Baron Zemo, I think, is potentially replaceable. One of the directions I think you could go with this deck is cutting Zemo and a 2, I'm kind of leaning Surge, for Gladiator and Fenris Wolf. I think that might be a meaningful upgrade. Gladiator is a lot better now that people are not playing so many decks with big cards in them and are instead playing a lot of smaller decks that are more than the sum of their parts. He's gonna sell the game a lot less. And Fenris Wolf is obviously good if you can get some real things to happen there. So I think there is potential for this deck to go upwards as well. In addition, Baron Zemo might seem like a little bit of an odd pull on his own, but baseline 3-5 is pretty solid, and in a metagame where so many people are playing a lot of decks that are just full of really good 2s, this card pulling a Mr. Fantastic, this card pulling a Surge, that kind of stuff can be very valuable for you just at baseline. 3-5 steal your opponent's Mr. Fantastic is a great card when that happens. V-Hand is occupying roughly the same space as the previous list here. These are both Luna Snow-based decks with the combination of Misery and the Hood and Shadow King in them. They're doing a lot of similar stuff, and I think it's fair to describe them as occupying similar space, but V-Hand has a bit of a higher ceiling, and maybe I think you could argue a bit of a lower floor, thanks to its relative vulnerability to Killmonger, which is a very powerful card, and because it's not necessarily going to be able to match the Surfer decks on points even with the good draws unless the Shadow King is relevant, which puts it in a fairly awkward scenario some of the time, even though I do think it's occupying basically the same niche. Since we already talked about the metagame positioning when talking about the previous deck, I'm going to talk about what's unique about this version specifically, and it is an increased range. The addition of the point to Mirage, being able to get more stuff that is less vulnerable to Killmonger a lot of the time, with that alongside a Quinjet, discounting your 2s, you also get 2s off of Infinity Ultron, you can play around Killmonger in a way that I think other Victoria hand decks might struggle to do. The Ancient One gives you an extremely powerful ceiling, and one thing you'll have to keep in mind when playing this deck is that you'll often have a bunch of branching paths available to you, and you'll have to figure out which one makes the most sense in the context of the individual game that you're playing. This is definitely a deck that will stress you out because there are always going to be other things that you could have reasonably done. When people say decks play themselves, they often refer to decks that have one sort of obvious play line given your hand that makes it pretty clear what you're supposed to be doing in most cases. This is not one of those decks. I do think that it is the kind of thing that requires finesse and an understanding of the matchups you're in and which directions to drive in, so to speak. Normally, I would save Destroy for the end of a video, but now that everyone has Kid Omega, I think it might be worth talking about the Roram Destroy build. There are two interactions that I want to specifically highlight with Kid Omega, and I realize that people might get mad at me for saying everyone has Kid Omega. That's not what I meant. Everyone can have Kid Omega. He is now available in the token shop as opposed to for $10 million of questionable gold currency. So, with that said, there are two interactions with Kid Omega that are worth pointing out. The first is that Agony interacts badly. If you play a Deadpool onto an Agony and activate a Kid Omega on that Deadpool, it's not going to work the way you want it to. The second one, though, is that Deadpool himself works the right way. That works the way you want it to, which is to say Deadpool will double and then give his power to the Kid Omega. So what that means is you want to use your Kid Omega as a late Deadpool thing. You don't want to be using Kid Omega early if you can avoid it at all. You want to be using Kid Omega for your last Deadpool proc so that you get, say, 24 power on your Kid Omega instead of 4. That's really important. You are going to be able to do that, but you're not necessarily going to want to use him until you can extract maximum value from him. It works sort of the same way that Dracula Apocalypse does. You know how Dracula discards Apocalypse. By the time Apocalypse goes back to hand, it has counted itself as being discarded, and so Dracula gets the additional 4 points. It's basically the same thing here. Deadpool counts itself as being destroyed. It has gotten the additional points. That's what's going on here. The rest of the deck is built on turboing out things so that in the games where you are not turbo Deadpooling, you are still going to be able to do strong stuff. This is definitely a deck that has some issues some of the time with the fact that Cosmo has a pretty high play rate, but a lot of the decks that are playing Cosmo are not decks that are going to be able to take priority early. And with Killmonger, you are often able to blow things up, maintain priority the entire game as long as you want it, and then perhaps get rid of it when you don't want it. You do have to be aware of potential, if you have priority, for your opponent's Killmonger to blow up your Deadpool if you've highly invested in it, stuff like that. But generally speaking, we're in a pretty points-heavy metagame, and you are going to be able to do points pretty profitably. There are tech cards that are good against you. Things like Shang-Chi and Shadow King and Mobius and Enchantress are all relevant in various ways. Enchantress can hit your null. You can get Mobius out of playing Death. You can obviously get all of your scalers that have green power shut down by a Shadow King, and if they get big enough, getting Shang-Chi is definitely a way to lose. It's a deck that has a lot of sort of consistent vulnerabilities, but it still manages to output power fine, and that's really what matters when it comes to a metagame that looks like this. You are going to have to manage priority well and have a good read on what tech cards your opponent is playing, because the way you have to play against someone who potentially has a Killmonger versus the way you have to play against other tech cards is going to be notably different. You can just play normal Eggy move. I know that I recommended people play this with Mr. Fantastic First Steps, and I still think that's a pretty solid option, but I can't say for sure that it's strictly better, and I don't think people need to go out and get Mr. Fantastic First Steps if they want to play this deck. If you do want to put Mr. Fantastic First Steps in the deck, I think it's pretty solid. You can easily replace Fan Fei with it, but this is just a solid deck that manages to create very awkward situations for your opponent. It manages to be a very powerful, movable Cosmo deck, and having a potentially movable Cosmo is one of the hardest things to play around in this entire game. There's so much in this deck that creates not just 50-50s, but things that feel like 50-50s, but actually aren't. And that's really what this deck is about. Your opponents will think, oh, they guessed right on the 50-50. It wasn't a 50-50. There was nothing they could have done. And I think a lot of that sort of shutdown power is what is so devastating about this deck. It does require a lot. This deck will melt your brain. There's a ton to think about all of the time. The mix-up on the 6th turn with Heimdall versus Hulkling is one of the most important things in this entire deck. Like, you can really try to juke people out with that one. There's a lot to be said for the power of a deck like this. I think it is quite strong, but I think it's also pretty dependent on being able to get a read on what your opponent thinks you're going to do, which is difficult sometimes. If you just want the world's most generically good deck, that's probably Silver Surfer. Now, I know people were very high on Human Torch First Steps, and were saying things that he would definitely replace Sebastian Shaw in Surfer. I think that's reasonable. I think they're like fairly close. What I will say is this. I do not think Human Torch First Steps is competing to be the first best buff target of cards in this deck. I do not think Human Torch First Steps is competing to be the second best target of buff cards in this deck. I think he's competing to be the third. We have Brood and Captain Carter, who are both clearly above Human Torch First Steps, in my opinion. The competition is for third best target between him and Sebastian Shaw. And I think that competition right now is roughly equal. One of them is far better if you have it sitting in hand and you need to be doing other stuff, while one of them is much better if you are able to play it onto the board and avoid the interaction that your opponent has. Now, the other remaining cards in this deck are really, really, really unique. There are 3 slots that I think are sort of up for grabs. They are, in this list, Juggernaut, Killmonger, and Mobius. Those are your 3 I'm gonna adjust to the metagame tech slots. The rest of this stuff is pretty baked in. You have your Mr. Fantastic First Steps, you have your Surge, you pick one other 2-drop that you like. In this case, I've chosen Sam Wilson to work better with Captain Carter, and then the point package is pretty much locked in. Maybe you swap a Shaw for a Human Torch First Steps. But those 3 cards are the ones where you have the most ability to customize this deck to the metagame, because those are the cards you use to interact with people or prevent them from interacting with you. Cosmo is a card you could play here. That's a very viable thing to do. I have opted for these 3 because I generally enjoy being able to be a Killmonger Mobius deck when I can, but I can totally believe that it might be better to play Cosmo over Mobius right now. I could believe that you might want to be a Red Guardian deck. There's a lot to think about when it comes to those 3 slots, whereas I think the rest of the deck roughly builds itself at this point. Another fun little Mirage deck is operating in a space that I think probably should have been operated in a little bit earlier. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is, why is it that every Agamoto deck has been a Sentry Annihilus deck? It's not like people have independently tried a bunch of Agamoto decks and come to the conclusion that Sentry Annihilus is better. It's just that that's become the default mode of playing this deck. And I am not positive that that is correct. So I like to see people experimenting with different top ends in the Agamoto stuff. I've seen people doing Mercury Cannonball stuff in there, and I've seen this deck, which is from Zombies Go Nom Nom, and I think it's a very solid way of exploring a clearly already powerful shell and seeing what else can be done in it. Jennifer Kale gives us another option for getting 5 drops out early, in addition to Luna Snow. So she is also in this deck as a 2/3, and that means that you have a ton of ability to ramp out Infinity Ultron, to ramp out Agamoto, and to then set about doing whatever stupid Agamoto things you feel like doing. There's a lot of extra energy in this deck. You are going to be able to use a lot of the cards you have, which is why I want to give special highlight to King Atri, who's a card that draws you a card. You actually care a lot about that. And the cards that put cards in your hand, you care a lot about that too. Because you have so much extra energy between the Rampers and Bolts of Balthak, you want to be able to actually use that energy profitably to play cards. It doesn't matter how much energy you have if you aren't actually converting it into points on the board. So you have a lot of cards that fill up your hand and add stuff to your hand, and you have a lot of cards that give you extra energy, so the whole deck sort of functions as a well-oiled machine. A Derek list that is built around the premise of being a Moon Girl deck that doesn't have to be a full Moon Girl deck, i.e. this is a deck that is looking to be a powerful output of points, but one that is not married to something that gets shut down by Mobius in the way that a She-Hulk Moon Girl deck typically is. It's a fusion of Moon Girl and mid-range, and I have typically enjoyed Moon Girl the most when it is in a form like this. Note that Derek says that he would cut Makari in order to get a Viper in there so that he can use it to clog up opposing boards with the Hood. I am pretty suspicious of that personally. I've kind of enjoyed the Makari, so I don't really want to be able to, I don't want to make that change just yet, but I will mention it here just in case anyone else wants to make that change, and also because there are probably people who don't own Makari, so you might as well know that Viper is maybe even better. This is a deck that reminds me a lot of the old Yo Woody Moon Girl list, which was a similar concept, a Moon Girl list that doesn't invest wholly in getting completely owned by Mobius, half mid-range, half combo finish, so that you have the ability to be a mid-range deck with a much higher ceiling than other mid-range decks. I think it's a viable approach to this archetype, and maybe the first time I've actually been legit impressed with a Moon Girl deck, in large part because it doesn't just fold to Mobius. I often feel like with Moon Girl decks, like if I were going to play a deck that folded to Mobius, I'd rather just play negative, right? And this is a version of the deck that does not fold to Mobius, and so it doesn't fail that sort of comparison. All right, let's get weird for these last couple of decks. Here is what Butt actually beat me with recently. I cannot honestly say I recommend this, but it is the kind of thing that I should put out there just so people know what the hell is going on if they run into it on stream. What's going on here is Morgan Le Fay Surfer combination discard and Morgan type stuff. So right now, Morgan working with discarded stuff means that if you Corvus Glaive, Morgan will bring back the stuff you Corvus Glaved. So you have this extra energy and you have this extra power, and that's pretty much the idea. You're just doing points in this deck. There's some cool Gambit stuff some of the time, but like not all that cool. You have the ability to target your discards to some degree with things like Swordmaster, but not like the greatest ability to target your discards. So you do have to get things a bit lucky to actually make them happen. But I do want to just highlight this because this is a deck that nobody would ever think would work, and I'm not necessarily sure it's good. In fact, I think I would argue I'm pretty sure that it's not. But it is a deck that can function, and I think it illustrates pretty well just how close a lot of decks are to actually being good. One of the things that worries me the most is that when people watch my tier list, they think that's just what's good and that's it. But in Marvel Snap, there are so many more different ways to hit the point threshold required by the metagame with a certain amount of ability to win 50-50s. And as long as you can do that, you're in with a shot. You have a real puncher's chance. There are a ton of decks in Marvel Snap that have a puncher's chance. Saved the weirdest for last, this is a Lockjaw Blink Tribunal deck cooked up by Zanade, and the idea here is that your opponents will have approximately zero idea what you're doing. You will have approximately 100% knowledge of what Lockjaw and Blink are going to get, and you will be able to set up the world's most annoying and surprising wins of all time. What I like about this deck is that it's a Tribunal deck that's not reliant on magic. What I don't like about this deck is that it's so clunky and weird and odd that I find it sort of hard to believe that it actually survives in a world where someone like me makes a video on it. I think right now it's getting a lot of wins out of people not knowing what the hell is going on, and that is entirely plausible. But I'm not necessarily sure that it continues to do so in a world where that is not happening. A couple of powerful play lines here, blinking something into Sarah early off of a Jennifer Kale, and then onslaughting the Sarah on 5. That kind of stuff is really strong. Or just Jennifer Kaling into Sarah on 4, onslaughting the Sarah on 5, and then having double discounts for the turn 6. That kind of stuff is really good. You are able to do a lot of powerful stuff in this list. You have a lot of extra energy. You have a lot of turn 4 Sarahs and a lot of ability to just generally output a whole lot of power. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.